teachers. What are the dumbest answers you've received from students on tests or exams? I teach physics and biology. The funniest answer. Me. Name any source of protein. Student. Platypus. The dumbest answer. Me. Why do we see lightning before we hear it? Student. Because sound travels slower than noise. My favorite answer in over 20 years of teaching. Question. In what year did the American Revolution begin? Answer. In France. I still can't understand what was going on in his head. I didn't even dare ask him to explain. I teach English in China. We're studying professions. I asked the class, what profession do you want to be? A model student's answer, completely serious. I want to be a potato. I teach at a school where students use iPads. All our work is done digitally. So on one test, a student inserted an emoji of a pizza instead of an answer. I don't even remember the question anymore, but I remember the answer well. Not a teacher, but in 7th grade, we had a grammar test. There were 10 questions, each worth 3 points. I failed all the questions and forgot to sign my paper. I got -3 out of 30. I'm not a teacher, but I know a guy who misspelled his own name on an exam. Here's an example of our dumb answers from school, like a meme. Anyway, we used to answer every question we didn't know with either 42, 6, or Jesus. Once we had a physics quiz I didn't prepare for, where I decided to write those 3 answers everywhere. The funny thing is, on one question I answered almost correctly, where I wrote 42, the answer was 43 inches, so I got 1 point for it. In the end, my grade was just above the minimum. Reply, give award share report. Save intoxicated browsing 702 points 3 months ago. Once I also wrote Jesus as an answer on a physics quiz. When I got my paper back, it said, I'll accept this answer, once and for the last time. Question. Who is known as the founding father of America? Answer. George Walker Bush. He got the George part right. So, can we give him 1/3 of a point? One of my teachers once told us that during a 12th grade exam, instead of an essay, one of her students wrote, I don't understand this topic, but here's a bird for you, and then drew a really amazing bird. Former teacher here. Honestly, that's a working strategy. We had specific grading rules, and by those rules, her student would have gotten AD, or 51%. If he had turned in a blank sheet, he would have gotten 0%. Is it dumb? Yes, but those were the rules. So draw those birds, kids. You never know when it will come in handy. My dad once told me that one of his students complained that they hadn't covered what was on the test. The question was, can you get pregnant from a handshake? It was the first year of medical school. This sounds like a trick question. Like, it can't be that simple. There must be some hidden answer. Maybe it's still possible to get pregnant under some crazy circumstances? Once during an exam, my student raised his hand to ask a question. His hand was completely covered in formulas. I'm not a professor, but I've had to grade exam papers before. I've seen people draw in their answers, write jokes in them, and beg the graders to give them a passing grade. Thanks to these antics, grading those papers for 12 hours a day wasn't as exhausting. Once someone drew a dinosaur, then tried to erase it. Honestly, it looked like they had a really bad eraser. The guy almost rubbed the paper to dust, trying to erase the traces of that horribly drawn dinosaur. Another time, someone wrote a joke in very tiny font. There were also cases where people tried to butter me up, like, Snooge, you're so awesome, I'd gladly bake you a cake. By the way, could you give me a passing grade? Edited. By the way, info for everyone in college right now, sometimes all this crap actually works. If you manage to sweet talk the grader, they might cut you some slack. I had one professor at university whom I absolutely hated. When I took my final exam with him, instead of using regular numbers, I decided to use Roman numerals. It was challenging, but I managed. Soon after the exam, he sent me an email saying he refused to grade my work. I forwarded his email to the dean, who responded that technically Roman numerals still constitute a viable form of numeration. The professor had to review my work. I ended up with an A. Oh, I have a great story about one of my students. Let me start with a clarification. In our country, if 70% of the class fails a test, everyone has to retake it. The highest score from either attempt counts. Once, everyone failed the test except for one guy who scored perfectly. But naturally, he couldn't improve his grade on the retake. So instead of answers, he wrote down a cheesecake recipe. I didn't mind, made the cheesecake, and it was simply amazing. Which country is this? I don't know where the author is from, but we had a similar rule in Germany, though it changed about 5 years ago. That reminds me of one of my classmates. When the teacher marked his answer as incorrect, we complained to have his decision reversed. Question: can you explain the consequences of the German invasion of the Netherlands in 1940? Answer: no. Technically, yes would have been correct too. It was just a badly worded question by the teacher. I was giving a biology exam on frogs and amphibians. Question: name several ways to save frogs from extinction. Answer: ban all French restaurants nationwide. Perhaps not the most outstanding or effective way to protect frogs, but technically, it was correct. I teach preschoolers, specifically 2-year-olds. Sometimes I give them picture cards and ask what's on them. Once, there was a card with a gallon of milk. I asked, where does milk come from? Immediately, one of my favorites shouted, "Mommy! Milk comes from mommies." Technically, he wasn't wrong. During an astronomy lecture, our professor asked the class how many stars are in our galaxy. No one raised their hand, so he randomly picked someone and asked for an answer. After some thought, the person said, probably at least a couple dozen, right? The teacher sighed sadly and said, well, yes indeed. Question: how do you feel about premarital relations? Answer: I wouldn't buy a car without test driving it. Not a teacher, but once I completely forgot to prepare for a test. I left almost all answers blank. The last question was the only one I answered. It asked, what is a haiku? Please write a definition and provide an example. My haiku was, I failed this test hard, should have studied much better. Now I hate myself. My teacher wrote, not bad, and gave me full marks for that question. After that, I started preparing properly for the rest of the year. Haiku is the most overrated crap in literary history. I remember when we studied haiku, I said, so what? Is that it? Last class, you promised us something grand, but this is nowhere near grand. My mom used to be a teacher. Once, she was testing 7th graders on their geography knowledge and asked, which island was considered the largest before the discovery of Australia? One kid replied, trick question, Australia doesn't exist. Hope you're Australian. When I was in 1st grade, the teacher asked, why does everyone love George Washington? One classmate answered, because thanks to him, we have days off. 3rd grade, I asked students to write definitions for several words. One of the words was parents. One student's definition was adults who have you. Surprisingly deep answer for a 3rd grader. Not a teacher, but I conduct driving tests. I asked, what penalty is due if you don't stop when the police signal you to? The student replied, if you drive fast enough, there's no penalty. I had a student who submitted code to me with profane comments. I had to have a serious conversation with him about professionalism. Little did he know the hell of my bachelor's thesis code. During a Japanese exam, instead of answering, one student wrote, I know nothing, sorry. I didn't study. I've disgraced my entire family and my cow. And drew the saddest cow imaginable. Edit. In case you're not familiar, the family and cow reference is from Mulan. Though Mulan was Chinese. Edit 2. There was also an assignment where they had to rewrite Japanese numerals with Arabic numerals, like 1, 2, 3. One genius wrote the entire assignment in Roman numerals. At first, I laughed, but then I wanted to kill him. Well, since the goal of the assignment was to demonstrate understanding of Japanese numerals, he technically did complete it, albeit in a ridiculously wrong way. I remember we had a test on Chinese characters, where students had to write a definition for the character 4. It's a proverb that roughly translates to, even a school dog can learn to read and write in 3 years. But one student translated it as, if you haven't figured something out in 3 years, you're dumber than a dog. Maybe he did it on purpose. I teach chemistry at university. Students were given an essay question. Can't recall the exact topic. Anyway, one student, who had no clue about the subject, instead of leaving it blank, wrote a detailed story about a lonely dragon who couldn't make friends. The other animals felt sorry for him, but the problem was that whenever the dragon was happy, he accidentally burned everything around him. This whole story took him 3 or 4 pages. Then abruptly, he tried to answer the actual question. I still wonder if the dragon eventually found friends. Poor thing. I hope he didn't hurt anyone. How did you grade his work? Did you deduct points for the story? I only assessed what related to the assignment. His story didn't affect his grade.